I call that in the appearance, which corresponds to sensation, its matter. But that which allows the manifold of appearance to be intuited, as ordered in certain relations, I call the form of appearance. Since that within which the sensations can alone be ordered and placed in a certain form cannot itself be in turn sensation, the matter of all appearance is only given to us a posteriori, but its form must all lie ready for it in the mind a priori, and can therefore be considered separately from all sensation. Immanuel Kant. After last week giving a brief overview of Kant's answer to the question of the critique of pure reason, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, I now want to start getting into more detail concerning his whole theory of cognition. And as I previously described, to him, we have, as humans, both sensuality and intellectuality, both playing an important part in cognition. In fact, the whole result of his critique is that we need both of them, that we can't have true cognition through sensuality alone, but neither through intellectuality alone, but only where they both come together. Here in this lecture, I want to talk about the first part, about sensuality. First, a reminder what sensuality even is to Kant. I covered this in more detail in previous lectures. According to the metaphysical definition, sensuality is our faculty of receptiveness. So whenever I am affected in some way by things, whenever I receive some sort of impression from things, that is sensual. That is not intellectual, that is not thinking, that is sensual. So in a metaphysical sense, sensuality means I'm passive in some way. And in the logical sense, sensuality, in the case of human beings, meant intuition, or as I like to call it, viewing. Because Kant stresses that our viewing, and viewing meant having immediate knowledge of something specific, something concrete, like viewing the color red or viewing the taste of sweetness. And our human viewing is always receptive. We can only have this immediate knowledge of something that affects us. That is why for us, viewing and sensuality are one and the same. Well, this sensuality of ours, Kant separates into two different faculties. That is the sense and the power of imagination. The sense is our sensuality proper, because that is the part of us or the faculty of us which is receptive. The sense is that through which we receive sensual impressions. It is, Kant says, the faculty of viewing something, viewing an object that is present. Right? So when a red object is present, then through the sense I see the color red. When a salty object is present in my mouth, then through the sense I taste the saltiness. this sense in general, Kant separates into two different senses. That is the inner sense and the outer sense. Through the outer sense, I can perceive whatever is, well, outside of me. So I can perceive extended bodies in space, including my own body, which, while belonging to me, still is outside of me in a sense, still is outside of my own consciousness. And the inner sense, on the other hand, lets me perceive that which is not extended in space, which is not external to me, but which is inside of me. My own thoughts, my own feelings, my own desires, all of that I perceive through the inner sense. As a side note, I previously, in my lecture on what is metaphysics to Kant, I talked about the various fields of the sciences that have a place in Kant's architectonic of the sciences. And I mentioned that natural science to him has two parts. That is the doctrine of bodies, of physics. Physics here not being restricted to what we nowadays would call physics, but all the outer natural sciences. So stuff like chemistry or biology would belong to physics in this broader sense too. And on the other hand, there is the doctrine of the soul, or psychology. Well, here you can see why Kant makes this division, because natural science deals with nature. What is nature? It is that which we perceive through our senses. So then, if we have two senses, perceiving bodies and on the other hand perceiving what is in our soul, it follows that there would be two fields of this natural science. But moving on, the other part of sensuality, as I said, is the power of imagination. I think sometimes it gets translated into English as just imagination. But the German term Kant uses is Einbildungskraft. And Einbildung means to put an image inside of you, if you take it literally. And Kraft means power. So it's the power of imagination. And I need to stress that in today's everyday language, we tend to call imagination only that which is not real. So when I'm telling someone, oh, you are just imagining that, then I'm saying it's just in your head. This is not what the power of imagination is to Kant. I mean, that is part of it. Imagination can mean imagining something that only exists in my head, so to say. So it is the power of imagination that that is responsible for our fantasies, for our dreams. But then things that really do exist outside of us still need to be imagined, Kant would say, because what you have in your head is like when you say, I don't know, when you see a tree or a house or a table, what you have in your head is not the actual tree or house. That would not be healthy. But what you have in your head is an image of that. So that is important to Kant, that and I will talk more about this in the upcoming lecture, that the power of imagination plays a part in the process of cognition too. In general, the power of imagination is described by him as the faculty of viewing that, or having an intuition of that, which is not present. So the sense gives me a viewing of that which is present. The power of imagination lets me view that which isn't present, which is almost a magical power, Kant says at some point. This power of imagination has two parts, two faculties, or maybe it would be better to say it can function in two ways, because of course it's one and the same power in both cases. One is the reproductive power of imagination, which, well, as the name implies, reproduces images that we have already had before. It is this reproductive power of imagination, Kant says, which, when combined with apperception is basically what he calls consciousness, self-consciousness. I will talk more about this in a future lecture. So the reproductive power of imagination, together with apperception, that is with consciousness, is what lets us have memory. So what allows us to remember things that, well, we viewed in the past but are not viewing now. This reproductive power of imagination, however, works, Kant says, according to laws of association. So different representations being associated with one another, one of them leading us to reproduce the other one. And dealing with that, describing that, inquiring into that, is more the job for empirical psychology, Kant says. It is not so important for the critique of our reason and for understanding our cognition. But the power of imagination can also be the productive power of imagination. And that is the power that produces new images, that doesn't just reproduce images that we previously had, but produces new ones. And this is, of course, what we use in our imagination, in our fantasy. But as I already said, and as I will explain further in the future, in the next lecture, this is also important for having cognition at all. One could wonder here, by the way, if the power of imagination, especially the productive power of imagination, if that really should be called a part of our sensuality. According to the metaphysical definition, sensuality means being receptive, being passive, while the intellect is the faculty that is spontaneous, that is active. And one could maybe argue that the productive power of imagination is active and not passive, right? And indeed, as I will talk about more in the upcoming lecture, the power of imagination to Kant is sort of the bridge between sensuality and the intellect. He still counts it to the sensuality, and that is probably mostly because of the logical definition of sensuality. That is our sensuality always being viewing, being intuition. That is being immediate knowledge of a concrete object, while our thinking, which is not intuitive but discursive, our thinking is mediated knowledge, not of a specific object, but of a general concept. And so I can come up with a general concept like unicorn. Then I am thinking about some general attributes like being a horse with a horn on its head. That is not the same as imagining a unicorn, because when I imagine it, I sort of see it in front of my inner eye, and I probably see a specific unicorn that has more than just the attributes that are necessary to be a unicorn, like having a horn, but that also has specific attributes. I imagine a white unicorn, or I imagine a black unicorn. And in that sense, the power of imagination is certainly essential for us, because it lets us view something specific, just like the sense does. Just the sense lets us view something that is present, and the power of imagination lets us view something that is not present. But that is what our sensuality is made up of. That are our sensuality's parts. Now I want to talk about what's more important to Kant, and that is, how does it work? And the first role, you could say, that sensuality plays in the process of cognition is giving us sensations or impressions. And that is exactly what the sense does, both the inner and the outer sense. Through the sense, we receive sensations from the objects that affect us, the objects around us through the outer sense, and ourselves through the inner sense, because even though it might sound strange at first, Kant says we, in our consciousness, in our thinking and feeling, we affect ourselves, and therefore we have sensations of ourselves too. These sensations are the subjective part of our cognition. It is important to distinguish them from feelings. The common language doesn't necessarily do so. So we could say I can sense warmth or cold. We could also say I can feel warmth, or I can feel the cold. To Kant, the sensation is about an object. It is what an object affects in us. So when I look at a rose, for example, I have the sensation red, or I smell the rose. I have a certain smelling sensation. or when I eat a piece of sugar, I have a sweet sensation on my tongue. And before that, when I look at it, I have the sensation of white. And those are sensations to Kant. What we see, the colors, what we taste, what we smell, because they are about the object. While on the other hand, a feeling is about us, the subject, and our current state, about whether we like this state and want to keep this state up, or whether we dislike this state and want to change this state. A feeling to Kant is always about pleasure or displeasure. And here I refer back to a previous lecture where I talked about Kant dividing our mind into these three parts: the faculty of cognition, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, and the faculty of desiring. Well, sensations or impressions belong to the faculty of cognition. They are part of the sensual cognition, not the intellectual cognition, but they belong to cognition of objects. While on the other hand, the feeling belongs to the faculty of, well, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. So when I'm happy or sad, or when I'm angry, or when I'm in love, that doesn't really tell me something about an object. Rather, it would be a great mistake to think that my feelings tell me anything about the object. If anything, they tell me how I deal with a certain object, how I react to a certain object, but not how that object is. Unfortunately, as I may note here, many unaufklärt people make this mistake and think that their feelings let them judge the object. So they may think, oh, I'm in love with this person, so it must be a great person. No. Maybe that person is a complete asshole. And maybe I shouldn't be in love with that person. But I happen to be. Or the other way around. People will think, I hate this person, therefore this person is an awful human being. No, maybe this person is the best person who ever walked the earth. And maybe that's why you hate him, because you are the awful human being. That is at least a possibility. I have often witnessed people being angry, being pissed, feeling hurt or insulted, and therefore concluding that the other person at whom they are angry or by whom they feel attacked, that the other person did indeed do something wrong, that the other person did indeed attack them. But that's not necessarily the case. My feeling in this case doesn't tell me what the person did, or how to morally judge it, if it was a morally good or evil action. It only tells me how I deal with that person's action. Maybe I'm feeling insulted for no reason. Maybe I'm being overly sensitive. Maybe I misunderstood something. Maybe I'm the one in the wrong. My mere feeling cannot be a ground to judge something. I need to judge with my intellect, and my intellect must not be ruled by my feeling. That is unaufklärt. Aufklärung means thinking for yourself, and people always think, oh, that means I must not let another human being think for me. But it also means I must not let my own feelings think for me, or must not let them rule and direct my thinking and my conclusions. But unfortunately, we live in an age where we have whole ideologies that believe in this and that base their politics on this. I mean, we have the ideology of political correctness or wokeness that will claim that certain actions are racist or they are misogynistic or whatever, not because they have intellectual arguments that you can understand through thinking and that could be discussed, arguments that they could convince you of or you could convince them are wrong, but rather they will appeal to feelings. They will say, well, this and that action, like these words that you must not use, or these things you must not dress in because that would be cultural appropriation or whatever, they make people feel bad. They will say this feels racist to people, or this feels bad to women or to gay people or whatever, which may be true or not, but cannot be a basis neither for politics and law nor for morality, because everyone is responsible for their own feelings. And the feelings don't tell us if an action was good or bad, if an action was done with regard for the other person or with disregard. The feelings just tell us how someone reacts to that. So it is important to distinguish sensation and feeling. Kant himself doesn't always do it. There are some instances where he too mixes the two. But to make it less confusing, I will in these lectures always clearly distinguish them. And once again, it is only sensations or impressions that concern us now in this lecture, and they belong not to the faculty of feeling, but to the faculty of cognition. They deal not with pleasure or displeasure, but rather with the objects and how the objects affect us. As I already said, sensations come to us through the sense, and the sense can be the outer sense or the inner sense. The outer sense, again, is made up of several senses, Kant says. There is what he calls the organ senses and what he calls the vital sense. The organ senses are called that because they are connected to a specific organ which gives us sensations that we can only receive through that organ. And they are the classical five senses. So seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. Those are the organ senses to Kant. The vital sense, on the other hand, is not connected to a specific organ and to a specific nerve, but rather here we are sensing something through our whole nervous system, Kant says. And there may be certain focuses in some parts of the body, but still it's a sense that cannot be connected so much with a specific organ as rather with the body and the nervous system as a whole. And through this we are sensing things like shudder or shock, but also warmth or cold, or sexual excitement. On the other hand, the inner sense is only one, Kant says. It is not made up of several organs. So he does muse at some point that maybe we also have 5 inner senses, and we just have a harder time distinguishing them than the outer senses. But that is in general how the senses are made up according to him. The impressions that our senses give us make up the material of our perception. So to Kant, sensation and perception is not the same. Perception also needs a form. I will talk about this in a bit. But the sensation is, so to say, one half of the perception, and it is the matter, the content of our perception. And without sensations, our perceptions would be empty. Like a rose is more than just the red color or the smell of the rose, and sugar is more than just the white color and the sweet taste. But if we wouldn't see a color, if we wouldn't smell or taste something, if it didn't have a feel when we touched it, then we could not perceive these objects. The sensations are, however, subjective, Kant says. They are subjective in different degrees. Kant says that the 3 senses of seeing, hearing, and touching, they tend to be more objective in this order, seeing being the most objective sense, touching being the least objective out of these 3. Kant characterizes those senses as mechanical senses, because here my body or my sensual organ is receiving a sort of mechanical pressure from the light, from the sound waves in the air, or from the surface that I'm touching. And he also calls these 3 senses instructive senses, because they instruct me about the object through what I see, what I hear, what I touch. I actually learn something about the object I'm sensing. The touch, by the way, while being the roughest and the least objective of these 3, is still, according to Kant, in a way the most important, because he says it is this sense which makes me perceive the world as 3-dimensional. If I were to only see things, I would only see 2-dimensional surfaces. But since I can touch objects, I learn that they are actually extended bodies. And then I can understand that even the things I don't get to touch probably also are extended bodies. And indeed, we can notice that newborn babies in their first month or even beyond that are very obsessed with touching things, grabbing things, even putting things in their mouth. So merely seeing them is not enough to really connect with the world and really learn about the world. On the other hand, the 2 senses of smell and taste, Kant calls chemical senses, because here there is not just mechanical pressure on the organ, but rather something is really getting inside our body and reacting with our body in a chemical way, on the organ of our tongue or in the organ of our nose. And these chemical senses, Kant doesn't call instructive senses, but rather savoring senses. And they are much more closely connected to that second faculty of our mind, that is the faculty of the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. Because it is possible to see or hear or touch something, and for that sensation to be mostly neutral to you. So you can see, I don't know, something blue without liking or disliking it in particular. While Kant would say it is more or less impossible to taste or smell something without, at least to some degree, enjoying or disliking that taste or that smell. So these two senses tell me less about the object and more about how I react to that object. And likewise, this sort of sixth sense that Kant talks about, the vital sense, that one is also more subjective than objective, he says. But in total, all the sensations, even those through the three instructive senses, all the sensations Kant characterizes as subjective. The difference between the three mechanical senses and the two chemical senses, and the fact that the latter two are more subjective and more connected with the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, that to Kant also shows in the fact that only these latter two senses, so only taste and smell, can lead to a feeling of disgust. Now, many people might at first disagree with that and might claim that the other three senses can also lead to disgust. I can be disgusted by things I see. I can be disgusted by hearing about certain things. I can be disgusted by touching certain things. But I would say that there's a strong difference here. Being disgusted by certain smells and certain tastes makes sense. It is a natural response, and there's probably an evolutionary reason for it. Because as Kant describes these senses as chemical, here we really absorb something. We really take something into our body. And so it's a good thing that we have a sort of mechanism that prevents us from just blindly absorbing anything into our body and possibly poisoning ourselves. So if we smell or taste things like feces or like rotten food, moldy food, it disgusts us and we are compelled to throw it up again, preventing ourselves from poisoning ourselves. However, when it comes to the other three senses, to seeing and hearing and touching, there is no real danger of poisoning ourselves because the object doesn't enter our body. It only touches us from the outside, especially when it comes to seeing and hearing, because here we are not even touched by the object. we are only touched by the light beams or by the sound waves that come from the object. So being disgusted would maybe be sort of justified when it comes to actually touching disgusting objects. But even then, you can, I don't know, you can play around with feces, you can touch rotten and moldy food all you want, as long as you thoroughly wash your hands afterwards. There is not such a big danger of poisoning yourself. So really, when it comes to the mechanical senses, there is no proper natural reason for disgust. And so I would say when we are disgusted here, it's not strictly sensual. It's not just that we are automatically disgusted by the way these objects affect us, affect our senses, but rather here the disgust is mediated by the intellect and by the power of imagination. It is our imagination that works by association. So you may see certain things that would be disgusting if you were to smell them or to taste them. And so you associate the image that you see with their possible taste or their possible smell. And that's why you react with disgust. And I must admit, even as a child, I had my problems wrapping my head around this kind of disgust. Like, I could never understand how people said that they didn't want to hear about certain topics or watch certain things during eating, that it made their appetite go away. Even as a child, I could have watched videos of people with diarrhea shitting themselves while eating, and it wouldn't have taken from my appetite one bit. Why would it? Those are just images. I'm not smelling anything, and it's not like I have the diarrhea in my mouth and I'm tasting it. No, I have the tasty food in my mouth. So why would I be disgusted? And I'm mentioning this because this sort of disgust I have always found to be the strongest in the most unaufklärt people. It can indeed be an attribute of unaufklärtness. Because Aufklärung is about thinking for yourself, but that doesn't just mean not letting other people think for yourself. It also means not letting your own senses and your own power of imagination think for you and just run wild and just be sort of pulled away or pushed around by your own associations. When you are aufklärt, the intellect governs sensuality, and the intellect governs the power of imagination and guides and directs it however it sees fit to rational ends. When you are unaufklärt, however, it is the other way around. Then you are compelled and pulled around by your own senses and by your own feelings and by your own associations. And I can tell you that as long as someone is unaufklärt, even in this respect, so as long as someone is, let's say, not able to eat and enjoy his dinner while watching videos of people dissecting corpses or whatever, then you can be sure that if he's unaufklärt even in this small and basic respect, he is far, far away from the deeper and more important Aufklärung. Kant would stress that sensations don't really belong to cognition in the proper sense, because ultimately a sensation doesn't tell me anything about the object as such. It only tells me how I am affected by the object. And different beings, different sensual beings, might be affected differently. We know for a fact today that there are other animals which have different sensations of the world. They may see colors that we don't see, or hear frequencies of sound that we can't hear. And they also seem to feel very differently about certain sensations from how we feel about them. So Kant, for example, says that we dislike the smell of carrion, of dead flesh that is rotting, while the crows seem to like it and seem to be attracted by it. Kant also is already thinking about the possibility of some birds having a sense for magnetism. So while we cannot sense magnetic energy, we can only perceive its effects. We can perceive certain objects being attracted by a magnet. Kant says maybe there are animals that can actually sense the magnetism. And even within our own species, certain people have different sensations. There are people, for example, who are colorblind, who are not seeing colors in the same way. And at the end of the day, no one may see colors in the same way. We all may have, to some degree, may have our own subjective sensations that are different from everyone else's. Because, once again, the sensation is just how we are affected by the object, not how the object itself is. So when two people eat from the same soup and one of them says it's too salty and the other says there's not enough salt, you can't really say that one is right and the other is not, because neither of them is making an objective statement. Of course, you can make objective statements here. You can say so and so much salt was put into the soup. You could even do a chemical analysis of the soup and see exactly how the percentage of salt in the soup is. But still, whether it tastes salty to one person or not so salty to another person, that is just how that soup happens to affect their sense organ. And that is just subjective. So there is this, you could call it the everyday philosophy of the common man, which likes to ask this question that probably everyone has asked himself at some point in his life. Is my red the same as everyone's red? Is my sweet the same as everyone's sweet? I mean, we just point at certain objects and say their color is red. So we learn the word red as children, and we learn to call this shade red. But is it really red to everyone in the same way? Or does maybe everyone see a different color when looking at the objects that we all call red? That is a common question of this everyday philosophy. And it is a question that can't really be answered, and that has no further sense. This is exactly where all the thinking ends, because this is not about thinking. This is not objective. It is not discursive. It is not conceptual. This is just subjective sensation. I want to take this opportunity to digress a bit and mention that in the so-called philosophy of mind, which is a school that became very prominent, especially in the time after the Second World War, and especially in the United States or in the English-speaking world, but which has also swept over here onto the continent. In this so-called philosophy of mind, they call this this subjective quality, so to say, they call it qualia. So qualia is what does it feel like for me personally when I see red, or when I taste saltiness, or whatever. And they discuss the question that is a prominent discussion, if there even is such a thing as qualia. So if you had all the knowledge, all the concepts, if you knew what red is in terms of physics, that it is a certain wavelengths of light, and that your brain possesses that light in a certain way, but you had never seen the color red, would you then know what red is, or would you not know, and would seeing it for the first time give you a new form of knowledge, give you new information? And there are actually people there, the materialists, who will say that there is no such thing as qualia. So you could know what is sweet, what is bitter, even without ever having tasted something sweet or something bitter, simply by knowing what it means chemically or biologically that a certain food is sweet or bitter. This is, of course, completely absurd. And it means essentially denying sensuality. This is, of course, completely laughable. And essentially, it means denying sensuality. Denying that there is such a thing as viewing, as intuition, denying that there is such a thing as immediate knowledge, and rather claiming that intellectuality, discursive knowledge, thinking, so mediated knowledge of general attributes, that is all the knowledge there is. Now, I had previously said that these materialists are denying the intellect, and that they are only believing in sensuality. And now I'm saying basically the opposite. I'm saying they are denying sensuality and only believe in the intellect. How does that fit together? Well, the short answer is it doesn't. They are just not making sense. And this is typical for unaufklärtness. One of the main characteristics of Aufklärung is consequential thinking, is being consistent, while unaufklärtness is the opposite. It is inconsistent. You will never find a single unaufklärt person who doesn't constantly contradict himself without realizing it. And here, when it comes to these philodoxers, because they are not philosophers, they are philodoxers, lovers of opinion, not of wisdom. When it comes to them, what you can say is they, in a way, deny both sensuality and intellectuality, but in another way, they confirm both, because they are not just wrong, because they are too cowardly to draw the only possible conclusion from denying both sensuality and intellectuality, and become complete nihilists, deny that anything exists at all. That would be wrong still, but at least it would be partially consistent, and at least it would require some measure of courage, of intellectual courage, and these people don't have that. So that would be one answer to the question, how does that fit together? But still, we can try to, as you always should, to understand them better than they understand themselves, about which I talked in my lecture on how should you read according to Kant. And we can try to at least make some sense of what they are saying, no matter how senseless it is. They are not philosophical enough to really ask the fundamental question, what even is the intellect? What even is sensuality? But this whole American philodoxy, it is no philosophy, it is merely philodoxy, love of opinion, not of truth. This whole American philodoxy hates and shies away from fundamental questions anyways. That is also why these people usually don't write books. You won't find books that are truly thorough and truly radical, truly going to the basis of our knowledge, like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or Fichte's Doctrine of Science, or Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Rather, they are only writing short papers, short essays about specific questions, without caring about the fundament these questions and their answers to these questions might be grounded in. And that's exactly why it's all mere opinion, why it's all basically like essays you might write in high school, maybe of a somewhat higher complexity or level of difficulty, but still ultimately different from them only in degree, not really in quality. But as I talked about in my lecture on how should you read according to Kant, we should strive for understanding certain positions, certain authors better than they understand themselves. So we can try to bring some sense into that which is completely senseless. And then what we can say to the question, isn't it a contradiction that they deny both sensuality and intellectuality? We can answer, well, they seem to deny it in different ways. They seem to deny intellectuality according to the metaphysical definition, that is, intellectuality being spontaneous. And according to Kant's metaphysical definition, they affirm that there is sensuality. Sensuality in the metaphysical sense being receptivity. They do believe that we are receptive, that we are passive, that we are affected in certain ways by the objects around us. But then in the logical sense of the terms, they seem to deny sensuality. That is, they seem to deny that there is such a thing as viewing, as immediate knowledge, and they seem to affirm intellectuality. They seem to believe that there is discursive knowledge, there is knowledge through general concepts. I said in the previous lecture that according to Kant, we can think of God as having intellectual viewing or intellectual intuition. That means we can think of him as his intellectuality, that is, his spontaneous and not receptive faculty, being something that doesn't think like our intellectuality, that doesn't come up with general concepts, but rather being something that views like our sensuality. So that comes up with specific concrete things that God views directly as they are. Well then, we could say that just like Kant describes God as having this intellectual viewing, these materialists claim that we have a thinking sensuality. So thinking because the knowledge is discursive, the knowledge is knowledge through general concepts, through general attributes. It's not specific knowledge, but sensuality because, of course, they claim that our thinking is not spontaneous, but rather that we are ultimately passive, that ultimately it's just a reaction to or a result of certain processes happening in our brains. Now, in Kant's concept of an intellectual viewing, which God might have, there is combined what is good about both our faculties, about the intellect and the sensuality. Because in this intellectual viewing, you have the immediate knowledge and evidence and certainty that comes with viewing, but also you have the spontaneity, you have the activity, you have the freedom that comes with intellectuality. Now, this other concept of these modern day superficial materialists, this concept of thinking sensuality, it combines what is bad or what is deficient about both our faculties. That is, it combines the uncertainty, the ungroundedness of our thinking in general concepts with the passivity, the mere receptiveness, the lack of freedom of our sensuality. Now, of course, this concept of a sinking sensuality is complete nonsense. It would mean nothing less than a consciousness that is not conscious of itself, a sinking of objects without there being a subject that does the sinking. That is not possible, but that is exactly how you would have to imagine the sinking of a robot. If a robot could think, if there was such a thing as an AI, a real AI, I mean, not what we have now, then it would work exactly like that. It would be sensual in the way that it would be, well, unfree, that it would lack spontaneity and would just react to being affected in a way, would just react to the electric currents running through this computer. But it would think in the way that it would work with general concepts and not have immediate knowledge of things that it views, but just mediated knowledge of the general attributes of things, of the general definitions of things. Now, I want to stress, I'm not saying this is thinking sensuality. This is how AI does think. Rather, I would always insist that AI doesn't think. There is no such thing as a real AI. A robot will always just be a dead automaton. It will never be more than a very complex calculator. It will just be a bunch of wires, just be a piece of metal and nothing else. But if it ever was possible for a robot, for a computer to think, this is how we would have to imagine it. So the way those materialists describe us, our thinking, they describe it wrongly, is how you would have to describe the thinking of a robot if a robot could think. And therefore, it is no surprise that it is usually those same people who have this very distorted and very primitive position on our thinking and our cognition. It is those same people who believe in this cult of AI, and you cannot call it anything else but a cult at this point. And it is those same people who are usually those transhumanists that you get nowadays. So those people who already believe that we are just biological machines anyways, are also the same people who believe we can fuse with machines, we can modify us with the help of machines, or that we can even at some point in the near future upload our brain into the cloud and become one with the AI. All those science fiction dreams, and I mean, it's just that, it's just bad science fiction. I have more belief in ghost stories than I have belief in these AIs, and I mean that's not an exaggeration, but I mean it exactly as I say it. I would take ghost stories more seriously any day. this is exactly what you get from this materialism. But this whole belief of these materialists, that there is no such thing as qualia, meaning there is no such thing as viewing, as intuition, meaning our sensuality is not a viewing, it is a thinking sensuality. This whole belief is obviously not just wrong, it is a belief that you simply can't hold. Because if there is one thing that is self-evident, it is precisely this. It is our consciousness, and it is the viewing in our consciousness. It is the intuitions we have of red or salty or hot or whatever. So you could deny anything else, and you could doubt anything else, but you cannot deny or doubt that. But still they do, despite it not being a possible position, not even a possible wrong position. Well, and every time you have people holding a belief that is not simply wrong, but just impossible and self-evidently wrong, every time that happens, you can bet that there is a psychological issue, and you can bet that this has to do with ideology, because ideology can lead to this. Ideology can make people's minds so twisted that they manage to talk themselves into believing the greatest nonsense. So why is it then that we nowadays have materialists believing there is no such thing as viewing? Well, I would answer with Fichte that it is mainly a moral problem. What they want is they want to escape from responsibility. If we are just biological machines, or even better, as they often dream of, if we can become machines altogether, if we can become one with the AI, then we have no moral obligation. Then we are free from freedom, and we are free from the responsibility, the moral responsibility that comes with freedom. And that is exactly what these people want. They are ultimately just irresponsible and evil people. But then on the other hand, we can also take their claims seriously. We must, of course, narrow it down. They are saying humans in general have no viewing. Well, how could they possibly know that? All they can know ultimately is themselves. So concluding that because they have no viewing, no one has it, that's obviously a wrong conclusion. But we may believe them in a sense when it comes to not all humans, but to themselves. Because, I mean, they will know best about their insights. If you met a person who told you there is no such thing as colors, there is no such thing as light or dark, and no human can ever perceive colors, and no human can ever have an impression of colors or of light or darkness, what would you think about that person? You would probably think that that person is blind, right? That person would then be mistaken to conclude from his own blindness that everyone else must be blind too, but his statement might still be true when it comes to himself. And here I remind you of Kant's methods, which I addressed in previous lectures. His critical method demands that we not just refute a wrong opinion, but rather we explain where it comes from. We explain its source. We explain the reason for the illusion that people are under. And his sympathetic method demands that we try to look at what is true, the partial truth, even in the error. Well, here it is. The materialists are, in a sense, right, as long as we take their statements to be just about themselves. They themselves feel like there is no qualia to all their sensations. They themselves seem to not really have a sensation of wetness or sweetness. At least that sensation seems to be not very strong, because, of course, it's not possible that they have no sensations at all. But we may believe that they are somehow blinded and deafened to their own sensations. And why that is so, that is something Wilhelm Reich has dealt with. He understood that people in our society, mainly because of the way they are raised, the way that they are treated as little children, people come to fear their feelings. They come to fear their sensations, and they are armoring up, so to say. They put a wall around themselves. They become stiff and deaf and blind, and they really don't have proper sensations in a way. But that's not natural, and that's not how all human beings are. That is a result of being hurt in their childhood. That is the result of a broken society that very early on breeds its children. So that in order to survive at all, those children have to armor up. They have to learn to suppress their own feelings and sensations. I cannot go into greater detail here, because then I would digress completely. Then this would turn from a Kant lecture into a Reich lecture. I want to give Reich lectures in the future, but not here, not now. The reason I talked about this so-called philosophy of mind and this materialism at all was, for one, to make these remarks, to give these explanations, to show how you can understand someone better than he understands himself, and to show how Kant, especially, is helpful in doing so. Because these people, they wouldn't say that they believe in a sinking sensuality, but I believe that once you come to see it that way, once you come to understand their opinions in that way, you can understand much better what they are on about, and also how they are wrong. The reason I made this digression and talked about this so-called philosophy of mind and this modern day materialism at all is, for one, to show the sorry state that philosophy is currently in. These people are talking about something and having great debates about something which someone like Kant or Fichte would deal with in 1 or 2 sentences, because there isn't anything more to say about this qualia. Precisely because it is subjective and not objective. And these people are not even rising from the subjective half of sensuality to the objective part of our sensuality. Not even to speak of the intellectuality, which is something that is completely foreign to them. this also justifies why in a history of philosophy, and I don't want to just talk about Kant, in the future I want to talk about others too, but in a history of philosophy they have no place, except maybe in a digression, in a footnote, but I certainly won't waste my time talking about them in length. But I also talked about this because ultimately what I want with these Kant lectures is I want to teach people how to think with clarity, how to think in clear distinctions, how to think not in chaotic opinions, but rather according to clear principles. And this is something you can learn from Kant, like from almost no one else. And that is why I wanted to show how, with the help of Kant and this clear and principled thinking, you can understand people better than they understand themselves. I believe with this concept of a thinking sensuality, we can much better understand what these people are on about and also where their error is, than by reading just their papers with their unfounded and unreflected opinions. But coming back to Kant, I will stress once more that he says sensations are subjective. Through them we certainly can't know the thing in itself in the transcendental sense, but even the physical thing in itself can't be known through the sensations. So the rose as a physical object, as our physics tells us, does not have a color. It just reflects light in a certain way, and then that light hits our eyes, and that is processed by our brain in a certain way, so we see the color red. It's not really a color the rose has. And here Kant comes to a statement that seems paradoxical at first. That is, everything that comes from the object, that is exactly the sensations or the impressions that we receive through our senses, everything that comes from the object is subjective. On the other hand, everything that comes from us, the subject, that is, for one, the form we give to the object, the form of time and space, about which I will talk in a minute. And on the other hand, it is the connection that the intellect brings into the manifold, the synthesis our intellect brings into the manifold of the various sensations. What this exactly means, I will talk about in a future lecture. But all that comes from the subject, the form the object has, and also the synthesis of the various sensations, that is objective. What comes from the object is subjective. What comes from us, from the subject, is objective. That may sound paradoxical at first, but if you think about it, it makes sense actually. Because whatever comes from the object is caused by the object, but it is not the object. It is us. It is what happens inside of us. I see red. I taste sweetness. The rose or the sugar cause me to have the sensation. They affect me in a certain way, but ultimately that tells me not what the rose or the sugar themselves are. That tells me only how I react to them. So precisely because it is caused by the object and it is the subject's reaction to that, it is subjective. On the other hand, what the object doesn't give to me, but I, so to speak, give to the object, its form and its inner connection, its synthetic unity, that is objective because it is the condition of the possibility of the object. Of course, not the object in itself, only the object as an appearance, but as an appearance, as something I am conscious of, as a representation in my consciousness, the object must conform to whatever is the condition of it possibly appearing to me. And therefore, this is objective. Therefore, this is not just how I personally happen to be affected by the object, but it is how the object really is. If by object we understand the sensual object, we understand the appearance, the phenomenon, not the noumenon. Because what that object really is a sensual object, is an appearance. It has no other reality outside of appearing to me. And therefore, the way it has to appear to me, because it can't appear in another way because of how my faculty of cognition works, the way it has to appear to me is objective. But let's move on to that objective part of our sensuality. I said before that sensation alone is not what makes perception. Imagine perceiving the rose or the sugar, and now abstract in your imagination from everything that is sensation, from the smell of the rose or the red color, from the taste of sweetness or the white color, and ask yourself, what remains if I take all the sensations away? And one thing that remains is time and space. Everything that we ever have any sort of sensation of exists in time and or space. So the rose, the sugar, they take up a certain part in space. They start at some point and they end at some point. They are extended bodies in space. And I can have the sensations only at specific points of space. So if I walk away, I stop seeing the red color, I stop smelling the rose. If I don't put the sugar in my mouth, I don't have the sweet sensation. And likewise, the sensations happen in time. They start at some point, they end at some point in time. But what are time and space themselves? That was a big question for Kant, especially when it came to space. It was a question that he already concerned himself with in his pre-critical era. And this question, or his answer of this question, is one of the cornerstones of his critical philosophy. Now, all our cognition is either intellectual thinking or it is sensual viewing. So time and space must belong to one or the other. And it should be pretty obvious that they are not simply concepts. Because a concept is something that I can explain to someone else. That I can best explain by starting from a more general concept and then narrowing it down. So when someone asks me what is chess, I can say chess is a game. What kind of game? A board game. What kind of board game? a board game that has these and that rules and so on. But if someone were to ask me what are time and space, I would have a pretty hard time explaining that. Everyone knows what time and space are, but no one could really give an explanation. No one could start from more general concepts under which they are subsumed and then sort of narrow it down. So clearly, space and time belong not to our intellectuality, which is spontaneous, which is active. They are not made by us, but rather they belong to sensuality, which is receptive, which is passive. They are something that we receive in a way. And this time and space have in common with sensations. Take the color red. The color red is a sensation that you don't just create arbitrarily with your intellect, but rather that you receive from certain objects, and you cannot really explain what red is, or what sweetness is, or what heat is, in the same way you can explain what chess is, or what a house is, or what an animal is. If you met a person who had never seen something red, who didn't know what red is, you could describe it all you want. You could say it's a warm color or whatever. That would not really give that person knowledge of what red is. So all you can really do to explain a sensation is to point someone at it, to say, look at this object, the color you will see is red, or eat this food, but you will taste the sweetness. Because it is not discursive knowledge, it is not something we think, rather it is intuitive knowledge, it is something we view. But even though space and time have this in common with the sensations, both of them are part of our sensuality, they are not sensations. If you think about it, we don't have sensations of space and time. Rather, we have our sensations of colors, of smells, of tastes, and so on. We have those in space and time. If all the sensations vanished, if we would stop seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling anything, then space and time would vanish too for us. That's not to say that they would be gone objectively necessarily, but we couldn't tell that there is space if we didn't perceive objects in space. Even if it's just our own body. So we could tell there's space if we were floating in an otherwise empty space, maybe. But if we wouldn't even perceive our own body, we couldn't tell there's space. And likewise, we can only tell there's time because we have sensations that change in time. Even if it is just our own thoughts and feelings, we still need this progress to tell that there's time. And also, an important difference with the sensations is this. I can imagine a person lacking a certain sensation. So I can imagine a person who has never seen red or who's never tasted something sweet. I can even imagine a world without that. Like I could write a book, a fantasy novel about a world that doesn't have the taste of sweetness. And I could also, if I met such a person, I would know how to give them that sensation, how to explain what red is or what sweet is, by pointing them at an object that will give them that sensation. But if I met someone who told me I don't know what time and space are, I wouldn't really know what to point at. But I can't even imagine ever meeting such a person, ever talking to such a person, because time and space just seems so essential. I can't imagine the world without it. When I imagine some sort of fantasy world, I can think away any specific sensation, but I cannot think away time and space, which contain all the possible sensations. It's simply not possible for me to even conceive of a world that is not spatial and not temporal. And that leads Kant to say that space and time are viewing, are intuition, just like the sensations. But the sensations are things we view a posteriori, while time and space are forms of viewing a priori. So when I go to eat food that I have never eaten before, I can't possibly know what it will taste like. I can't know if it will taste sweet or bitter or salty or sour. I can't even know if it maybe will have a taste I never tasted before. And likewise, if I go into a room I've never been to, I can't possibly know what color the walls will have. I can't possibly know what objects I will see in that room. Those are things I can only know a posteriori, through experience. But I do know a priori that no matter what exactly this dish will taste like, that sensation of taste will happen to me in time. It will start at a certain point and it will be extended for a certain time, maybe only shortly, maybe it will linger in my mouth for longer, but it will be temporal. And likewise, while I don't know a priori what color the room's walls will have, I do know a priori, before walking into that room, that it will be three-dimensional, and that whatever objects I will perceive in that room will also be three-dimensional. I mean, no one expects, even if we were to fly onto a strange planet galaxies away, no one expects to ever perceive something that is, I don't know, 5-dimensional or 18-dimensional. We can't even imagine such an object. We can talk about space having more dimensions, but it is not something that we can ever imagine, that we can ever view. But why is that, if you think about it? We usually don't wonder about that, but as Plato says, philosophy starts with wondering, with taking things not for granted. And how come that we are a priori certain that whatever we will ever sense will be sensed in time and space? Well, because they are the forms of our viewing, Kant says. So in all our viewing, which is always sensual, always receptive, the sensations make up the material. So they make up the content of whatever I'm viewing. But time and space are the forms of our viewing, of our intuition. And I cannot view anything except through those forms. As I said before, they come from the subject, from me, I give them to the object, so to say, because any object that affects me in any way, I can only perceive in time and space. That's simply how my cognition works. But that is exactly why they are objective, why I can be sure a priori that I will always perceive objects in space and time. Now, the things in themselves, the noumena, they are not spatial and temporal. So, for example, since they don't fall into time, I can't say that they are ever changing. I must say they are eternal, but not eternal in a temporal sense, as in existing for billions and billions of years. There are no years for the things in themselves. But the things as they appear to me, the phenomena, they must appear within time and space. And if there is a thing in itself that cannot appear in time and space, like for example God, then that thing cannot appear to me at all. Or if it were to appear to me, then it could not appear as it is in itself. So I can't view God as he is, but rather it would have to appear to me, once again, in time and space. For example, like God, according to the Bible, appeared to Moses in a burning bush. So in an extended body at a certain point in space and a certain point in time. Kant also sometimes makes a very observant remark that also very clearly shows that space cannot be something that belongs to the things in itself, but only to the things that appear to us. And that is the existence of left and right. If you imagine completely empty space with nothing existing, and now you imagine a single object coming into existence, being, I don't know, being created by God out of nothing. If that object was, I don't know, a cube or a globe, you could of course not tell left from right. But if you imagine that single object existing, being a hand or a shoe or the house of a snail or any such thing, then it would have to be a right hand or a left hand, a right shoe or a left shoe, house of a snail that is winding rightwards or leftwards. And if you now imagine God creating a second identical object, then if it was something like a cube or a globe, it could take up the exact same space if it was identical. But if it was a hand or a shoe or the house of a snail or such a thing, it could take up the exact same space only if it also pointed right, like the first object, or also left, like the first object. So if God created a right hand and then a hand that is exactly the same in any other way, has the same measurements, the same skin color, and so on, but was not a right hand but a left hand, then they could never occupy the exact same space because one is right and one is left. And this is not part of their definition. This is not part of their inner attributes, so to say. This is just how they appear to us in space. So here you can think back on Leibniz principle of the identity of the indistinguishable. I talked about this in my lecture on sensuality and intellectuality. And I said with Kant that this principle, that if two things are indistinguishable, if two things are defined by the exact same attributes, then they are in fact the same thing. This principle holds true for intellectual things, for intelligiblia, for noumena, for the things in themselves. So if I think of God with all his attributes, being almighty, being wise, being holy, being all-knowing, and then I think of God again with the exact same attributes, I have thought of the same thing. But if I think of a hand with certain attributes, and then I think of another hand with the same attributes, I have thought of the same hand, yes. But if I imagine two hands with the same attributes, I can still imagine them as two different hands, one pointing right, one pointing left. Because sensual objects are not just their definitions, they are not just the concepts, they are not just what I think of them, but rather they are also what appears to me in time and space. Now, here we have an essential part of Kant's transcendental idealism. And I talked about his transcendental idealism in a previous lecture, but now with this, maybe it becomes more clear. It is precisely time and space which are ideal in regards to the things in themselves, but which are real in regards to the appearances. And I said in that other lecture that Kant is a transcendental idealist, but an empirical realist. So that means when it comes to the things in themselves, then yes, time and space are not real. They are ideal. They are just representations in our consciousness. They don't belong to the things as they are independent of us. And Kant says that we could even think of other creatures that have other forms of viewing than our temporal and spatial forms. So we could think of creatures that are also sensual, not like God, who is only intellectual. So creatures that also have a certain receptivity and that also have certain sensations of the objects, but the sensations don't appear to them in time and space, but in some other form of viewing that we can't even imagine. We could at least think of that. So the things in themselves are not temporal or spatial. But in regards to the things that appear to us, time and space are not simply illusions. They are as real as anything can be. And to say that these things are temporal and spatial, like the rose or the sugar, is an objective truth. Because a rose or a piece of sugar is an appearance. It is a thing that appears in time or in space. The transcendental object, that unknown X behind it, that's another story. But the rose and the sugar, they are objects that appear to us in time and space. So time and space have objective reality in regards to those objects, in regards to those appearances. I can say that the sensations that they cause in me, the red, the sweet, and so on, those are subjective. Those don't belong to the physical things in themselves, but only to me. But the physical thing in itself, as a physical object, as an object that affects me, that object really does exist in time and space. That is not just my subjective sensation that I receive from them, that is the actual nature of that object that appears to me. Because that is what an appearance is. An appearance is a temporal and spatial object. Now you could ask, why do we have these two forms of viewing? Kant doesn't say too much about it. Of course, they correspond to our two senses. That is the inner and the outer sense. Kant says the time is the form of inner viewing, and space is the form of outer viewing. So everything that I perceive as being outside of me, including my own body, I perceive as being an extended body in space. Hence, physics being the science of extended bodies. And on the other hand, whatever I perceive to be only inside of me, inside of my own psyche, my own feelings, my own desires, and so on, that I don't necessarily perceive as being spatial, but I do perceive it as succeeding each other in time. Also, time is therefore the more fundamental of the two forms of intuition, because whatever I perceive as outside of me, I still perceive inside of me. Right? When I see a tree, I said that before, I don't have the actual tree in my head. I have an image of the tree in my head. So that means that whatever I perceive to be in space, I also perceive to be in time, but I can perceive things to be in time that I don't perceive in space. That means that space is the condition of the possibility only of the outer experience, while time is the condition of the possibility of any experience at all. Apart from that, however, Kant doesn't say much about why we have these two forms of viewing exactly. He rather believes that it can't further be explained. That's just how it is for us humans. And as I said before, he also believes that we can't rule out other beings having completely different forms of viewing. It was only Fichte who would go deeper into this and who would later give an explanation for our temporal and spatial viewing. One thing Kant does say, however, a few times, those are just remarks on the side. He doesn't go further into this, but they are quite interesting. He says that space might be the phenomenon of God's omnipresence, and likewise time might be the phenomenon of the dependence of all things from God. What does that mean? Well, as I described in my lecture on intellectuality and sensuality, Kant distinguishes between noumena and phenomena, things in themselves and things as they appear to us. And the noumena don't exist in space. Because space, once again, is just the form of our sensual viewing. So when we view the things that in themselves are not spatial, when they affect us and we have certain sensations from them, we have to view them in space. So the phenomena, they are spatial. Well, God is omnipresent. In the noumenal world, in the supersensual world, that cannot be omnipresent in a spatial sense. So that cannot mean God is in this part of space and he's also filling up this part of space. Like we could say the air is omnipresent within this womb, filling up every part of the womb, because there is no space in the noumenal world. So here the omnipresence of God, Kant says, has to be thought of more as a virtual omnipresence. So God is within each noumenal object. And they are connected through God. Their connection is not a spatial one. It's not like one noumenal object can touch the other object and push it or whatever, but rather it is God himself who connects them. And if one noumenal object influences another one in any way, now we can't imagine all of this. We can think about it in terms of concepts, we can speak about it, but as soon as we try to imagine it, that image will end up being a sensual image, because all our images have to be in time and space. Those are, once again, the forms of our viewing, of us having images. But we can talk about it. And when we talk and think about it, we have to conclude, Kant would say, that the things in themselves, they don't have a spatial connection. So if they are to influence one another at all, if they are to form one world, and one world means that all objects in that world are somehow connected, because otherwise each object would occupy its own world if it was completely separated from the others, then that connection can only happen through God. Well, now these noumena appear to us as phenomena, and that would mean that their connection, which in itself is not a spatial connection, that would mean that the presence of God within each of these noumena, which in itself is not a spatial presence, that would have to appear to us as well. And that appearance of God's omnipresence, that phenomenon of God's presence within all objects and of the connection of all objects within God, that would be space. And as I said, time would then be the phenomenon of the dependence of all objects on God. As I said, those are just small remarks Kant makes at the side a few times. I have already said more words about this than Kant has in all of his writing. But I do find those remarks quite interesting. They imply, for one, that, and this is what Fichte later will say, that maybe time and space are not so arbitrary. Maybe we can't claim that it's just us humans who have these forms of viewing, and other creatures could exist which don't view things in time and space, but in completely different ways. Maybe all sensual creatures have to view things in time and space, if time and space are phenomena of God himself. But also, and maybe more interestingly, what this seems to imply is a sort of Spinozism. Spinoza had been the pantheistic philosopher who had equated God with nature and said that God is nature. All things are part of God. Now, Kant is critical of Spinoza and disagrees with him. But in these considerations of Kant that he makes in some notes, it seems that he came close to a sort of Spinozism of his own. Now, of course, an important difference would be that this would be a transcendental Spinozism. So, while Spinoza had said that nature is God, since he was not a transcendental idealist, he was a transcendental realist, Kant would say that nature is not God because nature is nothing in itself. Nature is just an appearance. Nature is just a representation that we have in our mind. But nature is the appearance of God to us as the sensual beings we are. And while the appearance is not God, because that would mean that God himself was merely an appearance, you could maybe say that the things in themselves are God, or at least they are all within God. The nature of space, and to a lesser extent also time, had been hotly debated in the age of Aufklärung, previously to Kant. And you could say that there had been two parties who debated it, two positions on what space is. One side, represented by Newton, who was very important to Kant, one side was more empirical. One side was the side that was taken mainly by natural scientists and mathematicians. And the other side, represented by Leibniz and the Leibniz-Wolffian school, as I explained in previous lectures, had been the leading school of philosophy in 18th century Germany. This other party was made up more of metaphysicians and was more rationalistic in its approach. Now, the first, the Newtonian, the empiricist position, viewed space as a thing that sort of exists in itself. And that would mean that space is sort of an empty container or receptacle which contains all the objects of the world. But that would mean that you believe in an absolute space, and it would beg the question, this container, where is it? We cannot think of absolute space, Kant says. Our intellect demands that everything that is in space must be contained in space, so the space itself would have to be contained within a bigger space. Like, for example, this space here, my room, is contained within a house. The house, in turn, is contained within a bigger space, and so on. I cannot think of absolute space that itself is not contained within something else. Absolute space that would be endless, but still would be a thing that exists in itself. Also, Kant points out, and this is a thought he picks up from previous thinkers, he didn't come up with by himself, but he points out that space and extension in space, and therefore size, is not absolute. If you would suddenly shrink to the size of an ant, how would you know? You would, of course, know because suddenly everything else appeared huge to you. So you would know because of the proportions of things. But now imagine the whole universe shrinking at the same time, becoming super tiny, but all the proportions staying the same. Kant says the whole universe would fit within the shell of a nut, and we wouldn't even realize it. We wouldn't know if right in this instant we maybe shrunk to a tiny, tiny size, as long as everything else shrunk with us. So space seems not to be absolute, and this party of empiricists and natural scientists seems to be wrong in their assessment. Well, this seems to be in favor of the Leibniz-Wolffian opinion, which did not see space as a thing in itself, which just contained the other things, but rather as a relation between the things. So here space would be defined as the next to each other of the various objects. Just like time, by the way, would be defined as the after one another, as the succession of various objects. But against this definition, Kant argues that it's tautological, because you can only perceive things as being next to each other if there already is space. So them being next to each other cannot be what constitutes space in the first place. How is it that we even know things are next to each other? How do we even know there is a spatial relation between things? There is a distance between things. One thing is here, one thing is there. How do we even know that things exist outside of us and not just in our own minds? We can only know this because we already perceive them in space. And the same is true for time. We cannot know that one sensation succeeds another sensation unless we already have time as a form of viewing these various sensations. Because if there was no time, then there was no succession. So the succession itself cannot be the time, or cannot be what makes time. We only perceive time at this succession, and we only perceive space at these next to each other of the objects, but it doesn't come into being through this. So Kant would agree with Leibniz in a way when Leibniz says that time and space are just a relation between the things, but Kant would say they are not the objective relation between the things, because once again that would imply that time and space are already there, so that things could objectively have temporal and spatial relations, but rather they are the subjective relations. They are not the relations the things in themselves have to each other, but they are the relations under which the things appear to us. So time and space are indeed the forms of our sensual viewing. I said in a previous lecture, the lecture on what is science to Kant, that he says all relations between things are either subordination or coordination. And here we find that time and space relate to these two types of relations. Time is things being subordinated to one another, and space is things being coordinated to one another. because the things in space, they exist at the same time, and the things in time, they exist after another, so one comes behind or beneath the next. As a side note, it is quite curious that when we try to talk about time and space like that, we can only talk about space in temporal terms, saying that everything in space exists at the same time, just at different places in space. And we can only talk about time in spatial terms, imagining time as a sort of line, and imagining the various things in time as succeeding one after the other on that line. But anyways, through this transcendental idealism and this theory of time and space as forms of our sensual viewing, Kant manages to unite empirism with rationalism. And this is one core of his whole project, even long before his critical phase. Even in his very first work that he published at just 22, he had already tried to somehow bridge the divide between empiricism and rationalism. Here he says that both have their faults and both also have their merits. When it comes to the Newtonian empiricist position, it works great for mathematics and for the application of mathematics to sensual objects, and therefore for natural science. Because if I consider space to be an actual thing, a sort of container which contains all the things, then geometry, which deals with the measurements of space, can be applied to this real existing space and to all the things within space. But even so it works well for natural science, this position just doesn't seem to make sense for our intellect. Our intellect is not content with having to think of space as something absolute and as something never ending. Well, on the other hand, the position of the Leibniz-Wolfian school, the rationalist position, satisfies our intellect more, to believe that space and time are just the relations between the things, but it comes at the detriment of natural science, because if space is not something that exists in itself, then that can lead to skepticism if our mathematics, our geometry, which works in theory, will also hold true when applied to the actual sensual objects. And indeed, metaphysicians of the Leibniz-Wolfian school argued against the rules of mathematics, the rules of geometry, working for the actual existing sensual objects. So, for example, in geometry, it's very much evident that space can be divided indefinitely, and therefore the same holds true for all the objects in space. But the Leibniz-Wolfian metaphysicians would claim that for the actual objects in the world, this was not true. They could not be divided forever and ever into ever smaller parts, but rather they said, they must be made up of simple parts that are not further divisible. Because this is what our intellect demands. Our intellect thinks, well, if there is connection, if one object is made up of a connection of several parts, then if I imagine all connection ending, all the parts being separated from one another, I must think of smallest, simple, indivisible parts which serve as the base elements. If they too could be disconnected and separated into parts, and these two could be separated into parts, there would be no end to it. Now, this is an argument that works for the intellect, but once again, what it would mean is, what it would result in, is that we could no longer apply our geometry to the actual objects of nature. Kant has a solution to both these problems. If we consider the objects we perceive to be not the things in themselves, but the things that appear to us, and if we understand that they have to appear to us as spatial objects, as extended bodies in space, because that simply is the form of all our viewing, then we can say that whatever is true for space, whatever geometry says about space, must be true for the objects in space. So just like we can imagine dividing space indefinitely, we can also imagine dividing every object of nature that is within space into ever smaller parts. But that doesn't mean that the thing in itself can't still be made up of smallest parts that are not further divisible. So all of this is a great example of Kant's sympathetic method, about which I talked in a previous lecture. The method which always tries, when there is two opposing positions, two opposing parties, which always tries finding the partial truth in both sides' position and combining both of their partial truths and thereby finding a third, a middle path. And furthermore, this is also an example for how exactly Kant does this. Because again and again, in the various parts of his critique, when it comes to the concepts of the pure intellect, when it comes to the beautiful, when it comes to morality, when it comes to God, again and again, Kant will find these two opposing positions, empiricism and rationalism, or more precisely objective rationalism. And again, his solution will be a sort of subjective rationalism. So saying, yes, the rationalists are right in a way, but they are wrong in thinking that they are talking about the thing in itself. We can't know the thing in itself. What they say becomes right only if we consider it to be a statement about the thing that appears to us. So in this instance, the objective rationalists like Leibniz had said that time and space are the connections, the relations between the objects, and that is false if it means the objects in themselves, but it is true if by objects we mean the objects that appear to us, because time and space are the relations under which these objects appear to us. Now, as I'm nearing the end of this lecture, I will say once again, all our viewing, which is always sensual, which is always receptive, all our viewing happens within time and space. Those are the necessary forms, the a priori forms of our viewing. This is true both for what we view through the senses. Once again, the sense lets us view what is present, gives us sensations of that which is present. And it is also true for whatever we view through the power of imagination, because that lets us view whatever is not present. And it even, if we talk about the productive power of imagination, it even lets us view what doesn't exist at all, what we just made up. But it still only lets us view things in time and space, right? I can combine sensations differently in my imagination. I can think of a purple elephant, for example, or I can think up new forms within time and space. So I can think of a creature that lives for 10,000 years, or I can think once again of the unicorn, so of a horse with a horn on its head. But I cannot imagine anything that is not in time and space. As soon as I have an image, it is temporal and spatial. I can, of course, think of something that is not in time and space, because thinking, just discursive thinking through concepts, that doesn't have to be restricted to time and space. That's why I can think God or the soul. But I cannot view these things unless they become temporal or spatial. Now, Kant distinguishes two types of viewing we can have: empirical viewing and pure viewing. Empirical viewing or empirical intuition is what Kant calls perception. So our perceptions have two parts. One is the sensations. They, as I said previously, they make up the material, the content of our perceptions. And the other part is time and space as the forms through which this material appears to us. So when I see and smell the rose, or when I see and taste the sugar, that is a perception, because I don't just see red or white or smell the smell of a rose or taste the sweetness, but I actually perceive an object in space and time. Perception to Kant means sensation plus time and space as the forms in which the sensations appear to us. Or, as he also says often, perception means sensation of which we are conscious. And the important point is that all the objects we perceive are phenomena, are objects that appear to us. So even if we could bring more clarity into our perception, if, for example, I had better eyes, so I wouldn't just see my hand, but I would distinctly see every little cell that my hand is made up of. Or even if I had such good eyes that I could see every little atom that the cells are made up of, I would still see an object that appears to me in time and space. not a thing in itself. So here, once again, I refer back to my lecture on the distinction between sensuality and intellectuality. And there I talked about how the Leibniz-Wolfram school made this mistake of thinking that sensuality is just a more unclear form of intellectuality, or intellectuality is just a more clear form of sensuality. No, Kant says, no matter how sharp our senses are, no matter how much we clear up our sensuality, no matter if we use tools to make our senses sharper, like a microscope or a telescope, still our perceptions are only perceptions of appearances, of how the things affect us, and everything that affects us has to affect us in time and space. The things in themselves, beyond time and space, they can never be perceived. But apart from this empirical viewing, we also have a pure viewing or pure intuition. And when Kant uses the word pure, it always means pure or free of the empirical. And the empirical to him is the sensation. So pure intuition, pure viewing, is a viewing that is not filled with sensations. So there are no colors, no tastes, no smells. There are just time and space as mere forms without content. And we can imagine those. And we can imagine and even construct things within those. And that, Kant says, is exactly how mathematics are possible to us. Mathematics is a science a priori. It is not something we learn from experience, so it is not based on some sort of sensation. That is exactly because we have these forms of intuition, time and space, and a priori we can construct concepts in them. So it is more clear when we talk about geometry. Geometry, Kant says, happens in pure space. So I just imagine space as a mere form of viewing. And then I imagine, for example, a triangle in space, or I imagine a line in space. And arithmetic, Kant would say, happens in time. Because in the end, it is just a fancy and complex form of counting. When I calculate what is 5 plus 7, it is 12. Then I'm taking 1 quantum, 5. And in time, I'm adding another quantum. I'm adding 7 to that. And I arrive at 12. And this is also why we can apply mathematics in natural science to nature, because all the truths we find a priori, everything that is true about pure space and pure time, must also be true about empirical space and empirical time. Everything we find there must be true for the empirical objects we perceive in space and time, because it is the same space and time. It is not something that exists in itself. It is merely the form under which we view everything that affects us and that we have sensations of. In the previous lecture on what is philosophy to Kant, I already talked about his distinction between philosophy or philosophical science and mathematics. And now with this, this distinction maybe becomes more clear. I said that philosophy is discursive, mathematics is intuitive. Philosophy is cognition through concepts. Mathematics is cognition through the construction of concepts in pure viewing or pure intuition. Philosophy tries to go from the specific to the general, and mathematics goes from the general to the specific. Now, maybe it is more clear what Kant means by that. The philosopher starts out with a specific object. So the natural scientist maybe has a specific phenomenon in nature, or the moral philosopher has a specific action, like a murder, for example. And now they are trying to learn more about the concepts of this phenomenon, like the rain or the movement of the sun over the sky, or the concept of this murder, and they are trying to find a general law. Why is it raining? Why is the sun moving across the sky? Why is the murder evil? The mathematician, on the other hand, Kant says, starts from a general concept that he arbitrarily makes up. He chooses to say, I want to think of a figure that has 3 straight lines. And then he constructs that general concept in his viewing, in his intuition. He imagines a specific triangle, and by looking at this one specific triangle, he finds truths, he finds certain attributes of that triangle that apply to all the triangles. Like, for example, it having 180 degrees. In this lies one of the most evident proofs of Kant's transcendental idealism. How is it that it is possible for us to do mathematics a priori? And let's just look at geometry for now, not at arithmetic, because that is more self-evident, probably. How is it that a priori we can talk about space and we can find truths about space? Truths that in many cases clearly cannot be based in experience. So, for example, I can take a line, a straight line, and I can say that I can divide that line into 2 halves, and then I can take 1 half and divide it again, and so on, and I can do that indefinitely. How do I know that? No one has ever done that to finish, because I'm saying there is no finish. I'm saying I can go on forever. So clearly I don't know that from experience. Or also I could say that I can extend that line forever and ever. I can infinitely expand that line. That too is something that no one has ever actually done. Because, I mean, our lives end someday. We couldn't, even if we tried. So those are things we don't know from experience. We know them a priori because we view this pure space in our minds, so to say. And this, Kant says, also is the only possible explanation of why we can apply our mathematics, so for example our geometry, to actual nature, to the objects we experience, because these objects are not things in themselves. Then there would be no reason why our mathematics that is in our head would apply to them, and why they would conform to the rules that we came up with. but rather they are things that appear to us and that must appear within the forms that our viewing has. And so, whatever we can say a priori about these forms must also a priori apply to anything that appears within these forms. That is why mathematics, as part of natural science or as an instrument of natural science, why it works and why it works so well. With this, it is explained how there can be synthetic judgments a priori in mathematics. In previous lectures, I said that every synthetic judgment, that is a judgment that combines two concepts that are otherwise separated, any such synthetic judgment needs a third, an X, in which those two concepts can be combined. Well, that third, Kant says, is always viewing, is always intuition. And our viewing is always sensual, is always viewing of time and space. So either two concepts are combined in empirical intuition, because we perceive them being combined. Like when I perceive a raven and I perceive that it is black, then I can judge that ravens are black. And that would be, in the case of synthetic judgments, a posteriori. Or we combine two concepts in pure intuition. We construct them in our own pure intuition. And that is what happens when it comes to synthetic judgments a priori. That is what happens in mathematics. So mathematics is indeed a science a priori, but it is still a science based on sensuality. That is also the reason why, yes, it can be applied to real objects. It's not just a made-up science in our head, but only because these are sensual objects, because these are objects that appear to us in time and space. Mathematics cannot be applied to the things in themselves. We cannot apply our geometry to God or to the soul. So this is important to Kant's quest, because remember, what Kant really is all about, what his critique of pure reason is really all about, is trying to turn metaphysics into a proper science, or trying to find out to what degree we even can do metaphysics. And remember, in the lecture on dogmatism, skepticism, and criticism, I explained that Kant says the metaphysicians, the dogmatic metaphysicians, blindly believe that reason can answer questions about, for example, God or the soul, because in mathematics they find that synthetic judgments a priori are possible. In mathematics they find a science that doesn't depend on experience. Well, we can conclude now that yes, it is a science that doesn't work with experience, but it still works with sensuality, even if it is pure sensuality, even if it is sensuality that is empty of sensations. And therefore it is a science that can make statements a priori, but still statements a priori that only apply to things we can experience, that only apply to appearances. So this really doesn't prove that metaphysics, that a science that tries to be transcendent and not immanent, a science that tries to go completely beyond the realm of experience and that tries to have cognition about the realm of the supersensual, that is possible. Synthetic judgments a priori are possible if they are based on pure viewing, but it doesn't mean that a synthesis between two concepts without synthesizing them in viewing is possible. And here maybe it also becomes clearer. I said in the lecture on dogmatism, skepticism, and criticism that Kant says it is only history and metaphysics which need criticism, while natural science and mathematics don't need it. Well, they don't need it because they work with viewing, they work with intuition. Natural science is based on empirical viewing, it is based on perceptions we make, it observes nature, and mathematics is based on pure viewing. It works on us constructing concepts in our own pure viewing. But both of them do view things in time and space. And therefore, in time and space, they have a basis for the statements they make. And the problem with history and with metaphysics is that they lack this viewing. History depends on what other things viewed, but the historian himself doesn't have a viewing of what happened. And metaphysics tries to find truth without any viewing at all. And that's why those are the two sciences that first need to be criticized, and where we first need to critically examine the sources and see how far we can even get. So that concludes my lecture on sensuality according to Kant. I will move to the intellect with my next lecture, and that will take up several lectures. I will stress here at the end that so far we have not yet learned about experience. Just like a perception is more to Kant than a mere sensation, an experience in turn is more than a mere perception. Kant would say, if I touch a stone that lies in the sun and I find that the stone is hot, well, the heat, the feeling of hotness, that is the sensation. And perceiving that in a specific time and space, perceiving the stone that is hot, that is the perception. But that is not yet an experience, because I have not yet learned anything beyond the mere fact that the stone in the sun is hot. An experience would be if I judge the stone is hot because of the sun. So there's a relation between the two, a relation of causality. That is an experience. Now I learned something, and now I can work with that. I can, for example, be careful next time I touch a stone in the sun so as not to burn myself. Or I can, I can use the sun to dry up my clothes. I can hang my clothes after washing into the sun because I know that the sun is hot. If I didn't make this judgment that the stone is hot because of the sun, I could make the same perception 1,000 times. So on 1,000 different days, I could touch some stone or some other object like a car that has been in the sun, and I could perceive it as being hot without ever learning something. So that shows us that experience is more than just sensual. Experience needs sensuality as its content. It needs perception. But experience is something we don't just have, like perceptions. It is something we make. It requires intellect. It requires our own intellect judging about that which we perceive. Which is also why experiences can be wrong. Perceptions can't be wrong. When I perceive something, I perceive it. It could be an imagined thing. I could be dreaming, but still I have perceptions in my dream. What I don't have in my dream is experiences. I don't learn anything from it. I wake up from my dream and everything that was true a minute ago is no longer true. So experience is more than just sensual. Experience needs the intellect. And that is something I will start talking about in the next lecture. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.